go. All right, so we are recording. Excellent. All right, so we are here for All About Manatees with Save the Manatee Club, and this is Miss Cora Berchem, and she is Save the Manatees Club's Director of Multimedia and Manatee Research Associates, and she oversees the club's live webcams, video production, social media sites, the Manatee Observer Volunteer Program, and she also assists with Manatee research at Blue Springs State Park. So she's busy. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Communication Studies from the College of New Jersey and a master's degree in Film and Media from the JW Goethe University of Frankfurt in Germany. And she is also an advanced Florida Master Naturalist. She also volunteers for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, assisting with manatee rescues, releases, and recoveries. So we're going to turn it over to Miss Cora Berchem, and she will do her presentation. So thank you very much, everyone, and here we go.
Okay, well, awesome. I hope everybody can hear me. Thanks so much for having me. I hope all of this is working out, and I hope to have some interesting manatee facts for you. So I'm going to be actually sharing my screen in just a minute. So you will be going through a PowerPoint presentation, and then at the very end, I'm going to take questions. Like Nicole already said, you can post the questions throughout the presentation, and I will be coming back to them at the very end and try to include some of the questions that you previously submitted in the presentation. And we'll try to do some polls as well, seem to be working. So let's give this a go. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, so you should be able to see my presentation here in just about a minute. Here we go. All right, so hopefully you can see my screen. It's all about manatees. This is going to be my presentation, and I'm going to start this off with a poll and want to see how many of you are actually familiar with our adoption program, with our Adopt a Manatee program. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit at the very beginning of my presentation. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the organization that I work for before diving into manatee facts, diet, habitat, anatomy, all those fun things, and then going over some of the threats that our manatees are facing these days. All right, so I'm getting quite a few responses. This is pretty awesome. Okay, I don't want to get this going for too long, so I'm going to end the poll right now, and it looks like pretty much 54% are familiar with the adoption program and about 46% are not. Okay, so this is good to know. So Save the Manatee Club is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We were founded back in 1981 by Jimmy Buffett and Governor Graham. So we've been around for almost 40 years now, celebrating our 40th anniversary next year, actually. We focus on public education, outreach, legal advocacy for manatees. So basically every time there is a manatee issue that comes up or manatees need a voice, that's where we and our members will come in. We also assist with manatee research, rescue, rehabilitation, and release efforts as part of the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership. So that's a big group that consists of various agencies, including Save the Manatee Club, Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, the Fish and Wildlife Service, all the facilities that rehabilitate manatees, and many other organizations. And we do have an Adopt a Manatee program. So I don't want to talk too long about this, but I just want to let you guys know that you can adopt a manatee, and that's how you actually become a member of Save the Manatee Club. And most of our funding is coming in through the Adopt a Manatee program. So they are real living manatees, lots of them at Blue Springs State Park, where I get a chance to study them in the winter time. And the adoptions are a really fun way to support the club, as well as having that personal connection to an animal. So you get a manatee biography, certificate of adoption, as well as our handbook and regular updates about your manatee. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of information on our website at savethemanatee.org/adopt. So for those 46% that had never heard of it before, you can check that out on our website as well. So the manatee that we see here in Florida is called the West Indian manatee. There are different kinds of manatees or sirenians around the world. So they belong to the order of Sirenia. And as you can see here on the slide that I have pulled up right now, we have the West Indian manatee, which is divided into the Florida manatee and the Antillean manatee. Those are the manatees that you will see around Florida. They will migrate to adjacent states such as Georgia and the Carolinas, and they may go west as far as Alabama, Louisiana, or even Texas. And then you will see some manatees that are distributed wider in the Caribbean, such as in the Bahamas, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico, down to Belize, and even down to South America. Those will be the Antillean manatees, also a subspecies of the West Indian manatee. And then we also have the Amazonian manatee, which lives in the freshwater rivers in South America. And we have the West African manatee, which, as the name says, you can probably already guess, that lives in West Africa. And then a cousin species called the dugong. The dugong looks a little bit different than the manatee. So if you're looking at a manatee, it has sort of that beaver-shaped, round-shaped tail. And the dugong has more of a split fluke, like a dolphin. Also, if you're looking at the snout of a manatee, they're sort of turned up and down, so they can actually feed on the bottom as well as on the surface of the water, whereas the dugong exclusively feeds on the bottom of the water. And the dugong you will find around Australia and the Indo-Pacific. And then if you're looking at the very bottom, this is the Steller sea cow. Unfortunately, this animal is extinct. It was the only member of the order of Sirenia that actually lived in cold water. It was found in the Bering Sea. And unfortunately, it went extinct only 27 years after it was discovered in the 18th century due to hunting pressure. So now the manatee status today, manatees are listed as a threatened species. They are protected under several laws, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, as well as the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act. The manatee was downlisted by the US Fish and Wildlife Service in 2017, so it is no longer considered as an endangered animal. It was downlisted to the threatened status. And the main reason for the downlisting was the increase in numbers of manatees. So the numbers have grown. Surveys that are done each year right now see somewhere between 5,500 and 6,500 manatees in the state of Florida. So that is definitely an increase since the counting of manatees began back in the 1970s. But we do need to keep in mind that manatees were actually never put on the endangered list due to low numbers. They were actually put on that list because of the growing threats that they were facing. And as you will see later on in my presentation, those threats to manatees have actually grown over time. So that's why Save the Manatee Club does think that the decision to downlist the manatee was a bit premature, especially because it gives the public sometimes sort of a false sense of thinking that manatees are really out of the woods. They have recovered, they don't really need the protections anymore. And looking at the threats that manatees are facing, this could actually not be further from the truth. Now, about 6,000 manatees sounds quite a lot, but in 2019, we had over 600 manatees die. This year so far, as of April 24th, we have seen about 242 manatees that died from various causes. If you're looking back at 2013 or 2018, those were actually years when we saw even more manatees pass away due to red tides, for example, which is a threat that I'm going to be talking a bit more about later. But as you can see, they're still facing a lot of threats, so manatees still do need the protections that they have under those different laws that I just mentioned. So the average adult manatee is about 10 feet long and weighs between 800 and 1,200 pounds. Now, the largest manatee ever recorded was about 13 feet long and weighed over 3,000 pounds. Now, the female manatees are actually bigger than the males, and that's because they have the calves. As you will see later, calves are already pretty big at birth, so that's why usually if you see a very large manatee, most people will think that's a male. That's actually a female manatee. So now I'm going to give you another poll. Let me see if this works, because I want to know who knows what is the manatee's closest living relative. All right, let me see if this is coming up right now. So I'll give you about 30, 45 seconds to vote to see if you can figure out what the manatee's closest living relative is. And then I'm going to reveal the answer for you in the next slide and talk about some of the similarities that manatees have with those animals. So you can choose here from a seal, a dolphin, an elephant, or a walrus? And I see there's already quite a few people responding. I'm just going to give it another couple of seconds for you to respond. All right, looks like everyone has made their pick here. So let's end the poll and share the results. And I'm actually really surprised, 72% thought it was the elephant, and that is correct. So a lot of people will think that it will be a walrus, a seal, or a dolphin, but the only thing manatees actually have in common with those other animals is that they're all aquatic mammals. Now, the manatee and the elephant actually share a common ancestor. So both animals have very long lifespans. The oldest elephant, I believe, was somewhere around 80 or 90 years old. The oldest manatee we've ever recorded was 69. Also, they have both very small eyes. If you're looking at their flippers, they actually have little flipper or fingernails that don't really serve a purpose as such, but that's something else they have in common with the elephant. Their vision is not all that good. Like you can see, they have super tiny eyes, but the hearing and sense of touch is really good. And that's probably because manatees live in very shallow, murky water. So having good eyesight really wouldn't do them all that good. So they're relying on some of their other senses more so than their vision. If you're looking at a manatee, it actually has really tiny hairs all over the body, as well as on their snout. And all of those hairs are actually vibrissae. So if you're thinking about a cat and a cat's whiskers, that's the same type of hair that manatees have, but they have it all over their body. So actually each hair is connected to a nerve ending in the brain. So if you're looking at the brain of a manatee, you'll see that the area that's responsible for touching is actually very developed compared to the area responsible for vision. So researchers believe that manatees actually use those tiny hairs to sort of feel around in the water to detect currents, warm water, fresh water, potentially even for navigational aids. So those little tiny hairs are actually really sensitive and really important for the manatee. Also, if you're looking at a manatee's snout, it is what we call a prehensile snout. So again, if you are picturing an elephant picking up a piece of hay or peanut with its trunk, that's pretty much the exact same thing a manatee will use its snout when it's picking up the seagrasses. And then last but not least, both the manatee and the elephant have what we call marching molars. So manatees do not have any sharp teeth in the front. They only eat vegetation, but they have molars that are in the back of their jaw. Since manatees do pick up a lot of little rocks and sand and all that kind of stuff with their seagrasses, the front teeth will actually wear down and eventually fall out. And then they will replace their teeth in the back. So they'll actually regrow new teeth in the back of their jaw that push the entire row of teeth forward, almost like a conveyor belt, and then the teeth in the front will fall out. And that process apparently repeats itself throughout their entire life. So manatees never have to go see a dentist. Pretty cool. All right, so now manatee habitat. Manatees are found in tropical and subtropical waters. They can be found in salt, fresh, and brackish water. So you'll see manatees along the coast. You'll see them in rivers, in lakes, in estuaries. They're not really confined to either fresh water or salt water. They can go in between. They do prefer temperatures above 72 degrees. Anything below 68 degrees can be a problem for manatees. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I go over the threats that they're facing. Now, manatees look really fat and blubbery, but they actually only have about an inch of fat layer. So all like the blubber that you think you're seeing are actually really heavy bones and muscle. So manatees cannot stay warm in the winter time. That's why they have to congregate at warm water sources. The range of Florida manatees is primarily around Florida, but like I said earlier, some manatees do travel into the adjacent states like Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and some stragglers will even go up as far as Massachusetts. So there was a manatee that was rescued off Cape Cod a couple of years ago. It was rescued in October because the water there got too cold for it. It was rehabilitated, brought back down to Florida, and it was released over in Oak Hill, South Volusia County, on the East Coast. It was outfitted with a tracking device, And guess where it went? Should have done another poll on that. But anyway, I'll tell you, it went to the Bahamas. So that was actually the first time that researchers were able to document how a manatee from Florida was making a transition to the Bahamas that had not been recorded before. So that was pretty exciting. So oftentimes we do hear that people believe manatees are not native to Florida. They think they were introduced at some point to get rid of aquatic weeds or to control the aquatic vegetation. That is actually a myth that is not true. So manatees have been around for many millions of years. The fossil record goes back to about 45 million years. Now the modern manatee that we see today, their fossil record in Florida even goes back for about 5 million years. So manatees are definitely native to Florida. They have evolved around the state of Florida and the wider Caribbean. And the manatee that we see here in Florida has actually evolved from the Greater Antilles. So it's not a subspecies from that came from Mexico or South America. They are native to this area, and that's one of the reasons why some people think since they are invasive, they do not need to be protected. That is a myth that's going around, but manatees are native to Florida. They have actually been around for a lot longer than people have. So now manatee, like I said, they do have to live in warm water. So in the winter time, when the ambient water drops, they may migrate to natural springs. As you can see, I have a picture of manatees congregating at Blue Spring State Park here on the right-hand side. So either way, they go to those natural warm water springs, or they can go to man-made canals and power plants. So since the power plants are outputting warm water from their cooling system, this has become an artificial winter warm water habitat for manatees. So going back to the question whether manatees are native to Florida, I know we do see a lot of manatees in Brevard County, for example, and they have always been there, especially in the summertime. Brevard County has always provided a really great summer habitat for manatees. Now, those artificial power plants may have made manatees stay there for longer than they usually would have, because they have those power plants that they are wintering at. Some of those power plants may, in the future, go offline. They may be taken offline, which could potentially create a really big problem for manatees. So that's something I'm gonna address a little bit later in my presentation when we're talking about cold stress syndrome and threats that manatees are facing right now. But as you can see in this picture here, either way, manatees go to those natural springs or they go to those power plants. So manatee feeding, as you can see, is a little picture of a manatee feeding on some leaves. Manatees are herbivores. They can consume up to 10% of their body weight in one day. However, they don't have to eat that much. So for example, in the winter time, when they come to those warm water sources, they can actually go for a couple of days or even weeks without feeding. So they go to those sites to rest and conserve energy. There's not anything for them to really eat in the springs. So manatees will actually go for a prolonged period of time without eating. Now, manatees eat submerged as well as emergent saltwater, freshwater vegetation, as well as invasive plants. So you'll also see them eat hydrilla, water hyacinth, water lettuce, all those kind of things. If a tree falls into the water, as you can see in this picture, that's sort of fair game for the manatee too. We sometimes also see manatees feeding off of vegetation that's overhanging from a person's lawn. I know there have been some videos on YouTube lately where people saw manatees sort of feeding in their canal on some grasses that were hanging off of the side, reaching the water. So basically anything green is fair game for manatees. Now when manatees are eating, they will usually just sort of graze on the top of the grasses. They will not pull out the entire plant and destroy an entire seagrass bed. So I like to compare this almost to a lawnmower. The more you mow your lawn, the better the grasses will grow. So that's what manatees usually do. They sort of move around between different feeding areas, almost like a cow. You know, that's how they got their name, sea cows. So they may be grazing in one area and then move on to another area, graze there, and then come back. So they will not completely deplete an entire seagrass bed and eradicate everything, but they will actually move around between different seagrass beds. That is if things are in balance. Now, if we have a big seagrass die-off, which can have multiple different sources, which I will talk about in a little bit, this can be a problem if manatees do not find what they would usually be feeding on, and that could then become a problem afterwards. All right, so moving on to manatee sounds. Oftentimes people ask me, do manatees make any sounds? Yes, Absolutely. Manatees make sounds. They actually communicate by little squeaks, squeals, and chirps. They sound almost like a squeaky door or a squeaky floorboard. They can also hear very well, as you can see in the photo I have up here. One thing they do not have in common with the elephants, manatees do not have those big floppy ears. They have really tiny pinholes, sort of a hand width behind their eye, and those are their ears. So manatees hear very well, but they hear at different frequencies than we do. And I'm going to try to play this really short sound sequence here for you. This is going to be a mother communicating with her calf. So I hope you all could hear that. I know it's a really funny sound if you're picturing such a huge animal and they're making these really squeaky, squealy sounds. The higher frequency that you heard was the calf and the lower frequency was the mom. So you'll hear most communications between a mother and a calf. Since manatees don't really live in big herds or pods, you know, like whales or dolphins, manatees are actually semi-solitary animals. They will come together in groups for feeding or for warm water habitat in the winter time or for mating, but usually they don't really have like a big family unit. The only long-lasting bond is really that between a mother and her calf. So that's where you may hear those sounds, or if you have a big aggregation of manatees, you know, you may hear some of those sounds. If you happen to be underwater, you have a hydrophone, you can hear those. All right. So moving on to manatee reproduction, like I said before, manatee females actually do get larger than the males. The females can reproduce at around the age of 3 to 4. They will have a calf about every 2 to 5 years. Most mating will occur in the spring or the summertime. And that's when manatees get together in what we call a mating herd. So if you're looking at the picture here on the bottom right, this is a manatee mating herd in very shallow water. This is very common to see at this time of the year. I know our partners at the FWC get a lot of calls from concerned citizens right now saying they're seeing a big a herd of manatees in distress. And most of the time that is a mating herd. So it will be one female who is receptive and a larger group of males that will follow around the female trying to mate with her. And then after the mating is over, the female will go off on her own and she will have the calf. And the males will move on trying to find the next female. So this is a really, fun sight to see. Good to observe. Just remember to please keep your distance. Don't get too close to those manatees, because when they're doing their thing and they're in very shallow water and you're too close, that can potentially get really dangerous for both you as well as the manatee. So it's just something I like to throw in there, because we've had people who like to take a selfie of their kids right next to a mating manatee, and that's just not necessarily a great idea. So the gestation period of a manatee is about 13 months, so it's about a year. And the calf will weigh around 60 to 70 pounds at birth, and will be about 3 to 4 feet long. So that calf will stay with mom for about 2 years, during which time it will nurse. It will learn how to find warm water. It will learn how to find food, how to avoid boats, all those kind of things. And then the calf will go off on its own and the whole cycle repeats itself. So this is the only long-lasting bond that we see is between a mother and her calf. It's not your traditional family unit of a mom, dad, and the young. It is just the mother and her calf. And I don't have a picture of it here, but in case you can still see my screen, I brought this little replica here. You can see the little manatee sort of nursing on the bigger manatee. It is actually nursing from mammary glands that are located in the armpit area, sort of here behind the flipper. So oftentimes you will see a smaller manatee traveling right next to a bigger one, and that will be a calf nursing. So it's a really cool thing. Manatee mothers do not have to stop to nurse their calves. They can actually nurse the calf while they are swimming along. And they will have a mammary gland at both sides. So although manatees usually only have one calf at a time, they can potentially nurse 2 calves at the same time. And they will do that because manatees will oftentimes adopt orphaned calves. So that is a possibility. Manatees do have twins. sometimes, but it's very rare, about less than 1%. So it's usually just one calf at a time. It's a pretty big baby to take care of and a long investment. So it's usually just one calf at a time. All right, so I have my next poll here for you, and I'm going to ask you about manatees and their predators. So let's see, launch the poll. All right, I want to know which of the following do you think is not a threat to manatees? So remember, not a threat. Would that be motorboats, sharks and alligators, trash in the environment, or cold weather? So one of those four things here is actually not a threat to a manatee. So I see a lot of you are already responding. Wow, I already have 46 answers here. Okay, I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds, but that looks pretty promising. All right. So it looks like I believe everybody got a chance to vote. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And here we go. 93% think that sharks and alligators are not a problem for manatees. Let's take a look. Yes, manatees do not have any natural predators. We have seen manatees living in very close proximity to alligators, for example, at Blue Spring. There's never been any sort of aggressive behavior between a manatee and an alligator. Now, we don't know exactly why that is, but one of the things could be that a manatee is just too big. If you have a small calf, you usually have mom right next to it, and we have observed a mother manatee going between the calf and an alligator. Alligators oftentimes go after prey that they will drown and then let it sit for a couple of days to then come back to it. Maybe it just doesn't occur to the alligator that it could do the same thing with another aquatic mammal, the manatee. When alligators oftentimes just really like to grab their prey with their teeth and their snout, and the manatee is just too large. So those could be the reasons why alligators are not necessarily an issue for manatees. As you can see in this picture here, we have actually recorded a manatee and an alligator sort of like interacting with each other at Blue Spring. If you want to see the whole video, we actually have that on our YouTube page. Just look at manatee and alligator and you can actually see that. Now, sharks are not a problem for manatees either usually, because the really big sharks live in very deep water. And like I said earlier, manatees will live in shallow water where they can graze on vegetation. The seagrasses need sunlight to grow, so you will not see a manatee at, say, 60, 80, 100 feet in the middle of the ocean trying to find seagrasses because there's no seagrasses there. And you will not really find the really large sharks in a near-shore environment in 5 or 10 feet of water. So their habitat usually does not cross. However, like I said at the very beginning of my presentation, manatees are a threatened species. So not having any natural predators, there must be something that's affecting them. And that's what I'm going to go over right now. So one of the major threats to manatees is collisions with watercraft. It is the largest known cause of human-related manatee mortality. In 2019, we actually had 137 manatees die from watercraft collision. This was the highest number on record, unfortunately. This year, we already had about 24 manatees die from watercraft collisions. But there are things that we can do to help. As you can see, most manatees here, they do have some sort of scars from boat strikes. And this is going to be my last poll here. Let me see, manatee threats, here we go. So let's see if you have any idea which organ of the manatee do you think is affected the most when a manatee gets hit by a boat? Would that be the brain, the lungs, the stomach, or the large intestines? So I will give that a couple of seconds, maybe like 30 seconds or so for you to respond to that. Like I said, watercraft is a big threat for manatees, and most manatees, over 90% of manatees, of living manatees, have scars from at least one or multiple collision with motorboats. And those can be a pretty big problem for manatees. And after we're doing this poll, I will briefly explain to you why that is. All right, I think I got pretty much everybody, almost everybody here to vote, where about over 90% of people have voted. Okay, let me share those results. So this is very interesting here. Perfect. So 62% of you thought it was the lungs, about 25% for the brain, 12% for the large intestines. So I have to say, we have a very knowledgeable audience here today. Oops. It is in fact the lungs, because the lungs of a manatee will actually extend all the way from almost their shoulder area down towards the tail. So they have very, very large lungs. They have a very effective breathing system. When a manatee comes up for air, they can replace about 90% of the air in their lungs. Humans, in comparison, do about 10%. So very efficient breathing. Now, the problem is that the manatee's rib bones, which are very dense, very solid, heavy bones, they're located right along the back over the lungs. So if a manatee gets hit by a boat anywhere on its back, basically it can potentially break a rib and puncture a lung. So what can happen is that the manatee can get air or pus trapped in their lung cavity, which can make it positively buoyant, so it's floating on the surface, or negatively buoyant, where it sort of sinks to the bottom and has a hard time coming up. So that's one of the major reasons that manatees are rescued by our partners from the FWC. Now, what are some of the things that we can do to help manatees? Let's not be all negative about that. Let's try to see what we can actually do to make it better for manatees. So the number one thing is going slow in manatee habitat. If you see a posted speed zone sign that says slow or idle speed, that's a really good indication that this is a manatee area and you want to try to slow your vessel down. 60% of fatalities are actually caused by a fast speeding boat. There can be anything from a small jet ski up to a very large power vessel. 40% are caused by propellers, which that's still a very high percentage, but we do have to keep in mind that most of the fatalities are caused by the impact, blunt impact trauma of a fast speeding boat. Also, wearing polarized sunglasses makes a really big difference. You can actually see through the water, you get rid of the glare and you're able to see manatees. So that's not only when you're boating, it's a really good thing to have around if you're going out to watch more manatees, to actually be able to see them. Also looking out for manatee snouts and footprints. So I did put a picture in here for a manatee footprint. This is a circular pattern that the manatee makes with its tail when it swims. So you'll see those circular patterns on top of the water. Again, if you're boating or you're fishing and you see that, a great indication that there are manatees around. They do have to come up for air, usually every 2 to 5 minutes when they are active. So keep an eye out for those little snouts that are coming up as well. Manatees are air-breathing mammals, so they don't have gills. They don't breathe underwater. They will come up to the surface of the water to breathe. If you do see an injured, dead, or orphaned manatee, report it to the FWC. I put the number on here as well. We also provide free signs and boater packets as well as decals. You can see an example of that here on the bottom right, that yellow sticker. If you have like a kayak or paddleboard, or you like to go out boating or fishing, it's a really good thing to have on hand. If you are out on the water and you're encountering any of that, this is the number you want to call to report if you see a sick or dead manatee. So if you're interested in any of that, you can also contact me afterwards, or you can go to our website and request those signs and waterway cards or boater packets free of charge. So I guess, again, a good thing to have on hand. Now, like I said, manatees are identified by the scars that they have. So you can see here, this is our manatee specialist, Wayne Hartley, conducting his research at Blue Spring State Park. So we help with the statewide manatee research by documenting manatees season after season. And we have these drawings here, which are actually then submitted to the statewide database, which is run by the US Geological Survey Serenia project in Gainesville. So they have a really, really extensive database, including thousands of manatees all over Florida. And we just contribute a small part to that as well with our research at Blue Spring. And I believe somebody asked me with the questions that were submitted before, who is funding MIPS, which is the Manatee Individual Photo Identification System, which is the database that it goes into. So the USGS is a government agency, so this is how they are funded, but they collaborate with a lot of different agencies such as us, Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, the Clearwater Marine Aquarium, and I'm probably leaving out a whole lot of other agencies that are part of the program and submitting sightings as well. And what's really interesting is that sometimes we do get manatees at Blue Spring that we've never ever seen before, and we submit our photos to the database, and we learn that the manatees have actually had a long sighting history on the East Coast. For example, we have manatees that have a sighting history in Miami or Port Everglades or Brevard County, and they suddenly show up at Blue Spring. So that database allows us to sort of track and see where those manatees are going. So now another threat to manatees is cold water. Like I said, manatees cannot stay warm. So the loss of warm water habitat is a really big problem for manatees. Some of the older power plants are being retired. A lot of them have switched over from coal to natural gas, and they were recently repowered, such as the Port Canaveral power plant in Brevard County. However, at some point in the future, those artificial warm water sources are gonna be going offline. And right now, there is hundreds, if not thousands of manatees that actually rely on those power plants for warm water. Manatees are very site-specific animals, meaning the mothers teach their calves where to go for warm water, and we can't just put a sign up and saying, hey, next year power plant closed, swim north, make a left, and you're at Blue Spring. So currently there's no contingency plan in place in terms of what to do with those manatees when the power plants go offline. Right now, all power plants that are have created this artificial warm water habitat for manatees are part of the Manatee Recovery Plan. So they are obligated to put out a certain amount of warm water for those manatees, even during the time when they are remodeling the plants, because manatees do depend on that. I know somebody also had a question about the thermal pollution, which, yes, those power plants are putting out a large amount of warm water, which in the summertime can potentially become a problem when there is warm water being outputted into already warm water, which can then deplete the oxygen in the water. Some power plants do have plans on trying to fix this problem. During the winter time, the thermal pollution is not that big of an issue because the surrounding water is a lot cooler than it would be in summertime. Now, with the power plants potentially retiring, natural springs become ever so more important. And that's something Save the Manatee Club is advocating for, is making sure that the springs are protected, that the springs are accessible for manatees. Because if we try to wean the manatees off of the power plants, they need somewhere to go. So protecting those natural warm water sites, those natural springs, is really important. Now, when manatees do not find warm water in time, as you can see here on the bottom, this is a manatee suffering from what we call cold stress syndrome. You can compare this to pneumonia, frostbite, or hypothermia in people. They will develop these white lesions all over their body, become very lethargic, very emaciated, they'll stop feeding. So this is another reason manatees are rescued for every year. Another problem for manatees is entanglement. They can become entangled in monofilament fishing line, crab traps, or they can also ingest all sorts of debris. So again, one of the things we can obviously do, I'm sure you all know, is recycle our trash, throw the fishing line in appropriate containers. I put a picture here of a bin. And just as a little side note, we're actually currently doing a cleanup for manatees campaign. So if you're interested in participating, it's a virtual campaign. You can follow us on our social media, on our website, and this runs until May 15th. So wherever you are, even if you're not close to manatee habitat, you can do your part by participating in a cleanup, posting a picture of that on social media, of course, with social distancing guidelines being followed. And then we will do a weekly giveaway for everybody who's participating to win a manatee adoption. So if you're interested in that, go to our website to check that out as well. So now, last but not least, red tide and algae blooms are a big problem for manatees as well. Red tide will usually occur in salt water. We do see that a lot around Lee County, Collier County, Sarasota County, on the west coast of Florida, sort of the Fort Myers area. It is a natural occurring phenomenon that usually occurs offshore, but when it moves inshore and it's meeting a lot of the nutrients from anything from septic tanks to fertilizers to runoff, all kinds of things, it can almost create a super bloom and then stick around for quite a bit longer than it naturally would. So manatees can either inhale those toxins or ingest them when they are eating their seagrasses, and that can potentially cause seizures in manatees. And so you see here on the left, there's a manatee that's being rescued for red tide exposure. We also see blue-green algae blooms. I'm pretty sure living in Brevard County, you may be familiar with this. This is a picture actually I took in Port St. Lucie, so a little further south. Blue-green algae blooms usually occur in freshwater, and again, there's a lot of different sources that can contribute to that, such as runoff from lawns, fertilizer, septic tanks, freshwater releases from Lake Okeechobee. It's a whole variety of different issues that can cause that. Blue-green algae blooms don't necessarily affect manatees right away, but what the problem with that is that oftentimes they shade out the seagrasses. So seagrasses cannot naturally grow anymore like they would, and then manatees don't find enough food and will then revert to eating other things that they can potentially not digest. So this is something where you don't necessarily see an immediate effect. If we have a red tide, you may see a lot of manatees dying right away. If you're having a blue-green or brown algae bloom that's shading out all the seagrasses, you may actually see the effect a couple of years later. So it's very difficult to say, oh, well, we didn't see any manatee deaths, so this doesn't seem to affect them at all. You may actually see that a couple of years later. And then the last threat I wanted to just really briefly mention is manatee harassment. So harassment is basically anything that affects a manatee's natural behavior. So let's say a manatee is nursing its calf, or manatee is feeding, and I'm snorkeling or scuba diving around and the manatee stops nursing and swims away. I have just harassed a manatee. Now, not saying I did that on purpose, but basically anything you do, and it can be as simple as them changing their behavior all the way to people cornering a manatee, riding it, holding it down for a selfie like we see here on the left-hand side. Those are all instances of manatee harassment, and it is against the law. So the best advice that we have for all of you is practicing passive observation. So if you encounter a manatee in the wild, if you keep your hands to yourself and you just watch it from a distance, that's the best thing you can do. Manatees are really curious animals, and they may actually come right up to you and check you out if you leave them be. If you're trying to get too close for the manatee, you oftentimes just see the tail swimming away, and that's the end of the encounter. If you're just floating with your hands to yourself and you're not touching the manatee, there's a good chance that that manatee will actually come up right to you. Now, I know somebody had asked me beforehand also about feeding or watering manatees. This is something that a lot of people are not necessarily aware of, that this is not a good idea. Yes, feeding or watering manatees is against the law, unless the manatee is in captivity. You may have seen a picture of me bottle feeding a manatee. So this was actually taken in Belize. This was a rehabilitation facility where we were caring for orphan manatees. So we actually had to supply them with some additional nutrition at the very beginning before they were weaned off of the bottle and would be going to feed on their own. Now, if you're seeing people feeding manatees in captivity at a zoo or rehabilitation facility, that's a different story. We're talking about wild manatees here. And the reason why it's not such a great idea to feed or water manatees is because they become habituated to people. They will associate people with food or water. They will readily approach marinas, docks, boats, all those kind of things. And as you can imagine, not necessarily a good thing for a manatee to associate a motorboat with food or water. Many people think that manatees living in salt water really need that fresh water hose to survive. Manatees, like I said, have actually been around for about 5 million years in Florida. I don't think the water hose has been around for quite that long. So manatees will actually get most of the nutrition and the water that they need from the vegetation they're eating. Their kidneys can actually process that salt, and manatees will seek out fresh water sources every once in a while, but they don't need to drink on a daily basis such as we do. So I can assure you, even without the food or the water hose, manatees are off, they're pretty well off without being fed by people. So this almost brings me to the end of my presentation. I know somebody had a question about manatees in zoos, so I do want to address that very briefly. All manatees that you see here in Florida or in the United States that are in a zoo are actually there for rehabilitation purposes. So manatees are being rescued, rehabilitated, and then released. There's very few manatees that are deemed non-releasable by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's a government organization. It's not up to the facility who gets released and who doesn't. So some manatees have suffered such severe injuries that are not able to survive out in the wild. So those are manatees that are in captivity and they cannot be released. All other manatees that you see are going to go back out into the wild. Now, there are some zoos in Europe that have a so-called captive breeding program, which is actually the opposite of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make it better for manatees out in the wild so that they don't even need to come into rehabilitation. There was an experiment back in the day to try to breed manatees in captivity to make the population come back. That didn't work at all because manatees rely on their mom for about 1 to 2 years. So if you breed manatees in captivity and you release them out into the wild, they don't know what to do and they have literally no experience. So instead of trying to spend money and resources breeding in captivity and then releasing, what we focus on in Florida with our partners is rescuing manatees, rehabilitating them, and then releasing them back out into the wild. Because manatees really don't have a hard time reproducing. They reproduce really well out in the wild. So there's no need to artificially breed anyone in captivity to release them back out. Now in Europe, it may be different. I don't want to go too much into that, but this is not what we do here. So any manatee that you see in a zoo or an aquarium here in the United States is actually here for rehabilitation purposes. All right, so I think I'm going to turn it over to questions if we have a little time left.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much, Cora. That was a great presentation. You had me laughing at quite a few moments, so that was great. I really enjoyed all those facts that you had and all that really great information. We are coming close to the end of our program. However, as long as this meeting doesn't like randomly end, if Zoom doesn't kick us off, I'm totally fine staying on and we can answer the questions. However, any participants that do want to sign off, go ahead and that's totally fine. Also, as a reminder, this recorded presentation will be posted to our website in the coming days and maybe on your guys' YouTube as well. Cora, on your, oh.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, absolutely. I was just looking at the questions. Yes, absolutely. So we will be able to share that as well to make sure that those of you who want to rewatch it, or maybe those of you who didn't get a chance to sign up today, can see that too.
Excellent. Okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. So, did you have a chance to review the questions, or do you want me to just pick some real quick?
Yeah, so I can just sort of answer them in the order that they came in. I think some of them I may have already answered, so I'm just going to go over those ones a little bit quicker. We did have one question from Louis asking what is the top cause of manatee mortality. I think I sort of mentioned that the main cause for human related manatee mortality are boat strikes, but in any given year it can be outcompeted sort of by red tide or cold stress. So if we have a really cold winter, you may see more manatees being rescued for cold stress syndrome. If we have a really bad red tide, like in 2013 and 2018, you may see more manatees being rescued for that. So it depends on the year and like what problem we encounter the most, basically. All right. I have another question from someone. What steps can I take in school to help get a job in rehabilitating manatees? So most people that work with manatees obviously have some sort of background in ecology or biology, conservation, all those kind of things. Now, jobs with manatees in Florida are limited. There's not all that many. However, any science or conservation classes that you want to take are certainly helpful. My personal advice is try to volunteer or intern as much as you can. Like Nicole mentioned at the very beginning, I personally don't really have a science background. I have a background in communication. So getting a job with Save the Manatee Club, where I do a lot of the outreach and communication work, was a lot through learning by myself, reading everything I can get my hands on, basically, and volunteering both with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission as well as with the Bishop Museum of Science. They have Manatee Rehab program. So all I can really recommend is try to get your foot in the door, because there's a lot of people that get degrees and they have a wealth of knowledge, but it's really about knowing people and about trying to get some field work done and doing that. So I think there's a lot of different varieties to get involved, and if you want to get more specific answer, maybe send me an email and I'll be able to answer that a bit more in depth. So This one, all right. I think this is sort of similar. How can you get involved in the process of helping doing the rescue of manatees? So this is something you would want to volunteer with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, the FWC. They have actually 5 different field labs in the state of Florida. For those of you located in Brevard County, their lab is in Melbourne, and they always take volunteers to help with rescue, release, and recovery of manatees. So if you go to their website and look at their volunteer opportunities, that's probably the best way to get involved. You don't have to have any prior knowledge about manatees. They will provide the training. If you're not in the Brevard area, there's also a lab in Jacksonville, in Tequesta, down by Jupiter, one in St. Petersburg, and one in Port Charlotte on the West Coast. So depending on what area you're in, that would be the lab that you would be volunteering with. This is a good question from Patty I didn't address. Where and how do manatees sleep, since they are air breathing, living in the water? Yes, so manatees can actually stay underwater. They can hold their breath for up to 20 minutes, but every 20 minutes they have to come up for air. However, researchers think that manatees don't fully wake up when they come to the surface for air. It's sort of a sleepwalking kind of state. So that's again why if you see a manatee and you're swimming and the manatee comes up for air and you think, oh great, it's woken up, I can interact with it. It may actually just sort of like sleepwalking to the top of the water, taking a breath and going back down to sleep. So yes, they do not breathe underwater. They also don't come on land. I've recently got a lot of people who thought that if they wait long enough at Blue Spring, the manatees are going to come out of the water and bask and sun themselves. I think they were thinking about maybe a walrus or like a seal or sea lion. Manatees are fully aquatic animals. They cannot come out of the water. So yes, they will stay underwater and they sleep underwater as well. Is there a way we can help reduce or prevent red tide or algae blooms? Yes, so it is a bit complicated, but one of the things we can definitely do is, number one, reduce fertilizers, especially if you have a lawn and you're trying to apply fertilizers. Try to do it not in the rainy season, so not in the summertime, and try to not do it right before it rains, because oftentimes all of that will wash off your lawn or whatever you're fertilizing, and it can go right into the water, and that can potentially contribute to algae blooms as well. A lot of things we can do trying to reduce the nutrients that are getting into the water to begin with, because the nutrient overload is oftentimes a cause for algae blooms, both for the blue-green algae blooms and the brown algae blooms. And then, like I said, it can even further a red tide as well. If you are interested to sign up for our action alerts, we do have a big action alert network at Save the Manatee Club. So every time when there is an issue that we need the public's help with, be it a petition or attending a city council meeting or a county meeting, when issues like that are on the agenda, if you want to stay in the loop about that, that's something everybody can do as well.
Also, real quick, there is a fertilizer ban from June 1st to September 30th, where you are not allowed to use lawn fertilizer. Any other time that you do need to use fertilizer, or if you choose to use it, make sure that you are using at least 50% slow release nitrogen, and as well as making sure that your fertilizer does not contain any phosphates. Florida soils are naturally high in phosphates, and so you're not supposed to apply fertilizers with phosphates without conducting a phosphate test on your soils first. If you'd like any more information on that, you can also check out our website, savetheirl.org, or go to Be Floridian Now, and that will also have a lot of great information on fertilizer usage. And we're also starting a Be Floridian Now newsletter. Message me if you want more information.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for chiming in, because I didn't know exactly. I mean, I know about the website, but I didn't know exactly those answers. Cool. Okay. Well, I do have a lot of questions here. Trying to pick some. I'm trying to answer all of them, but if I don't get to it, I will answer them later. Somebody had a question about propeller guards. Why are they not required? So propeller guards can actually only be made mandatory in Florida by the US Coast Guard. So this is not something that we necessarily can implement. However, we are working with local partners. For example, if they are in the ecotourism business, to join specific programs, they have to have propeller guards on their boats. However, like I said earlier, propeller guards are definitely a good step in the right direction, but it's sometimes a bit deceiving to people thinking that if they have a propeller guard, they can go as fast as they want because they're not going to injure anything. I said before, 60% of manatee fatalities are actually caused by the impact trauma of a boat. So even if you have a propeller guard, you still need to adhere to those low speed zones. So yes, I'm definitely advocating for the propeller guards as well, but we do have to keep in mind that they are only a first step in the right direction, and they are not going to be able to fix the entire problem. Staying with the boating topic, Patricia wanted to know if manatees can hear so well, why don't they swim away from boats? And that's a really good question because we do get that a lot. Yes, manatees hear very well. However, I don't know if you guys have ever snorkeled or been scuba diving. I'm a very avid scuba diver. If you're underwater, sound travels a lot faster underwater than it does on land. So if you have a boat going by overhead, you have no idea where that boat is coming from. You don't know if it's coming from behind you or from the left or the right or anywhere else. So if I was a manatee who had to come up for air at that very moment, I would be really confused about where do I go to not crash into that boat. Manatees are very slow moving, so even if they were trying to get out of the way, they usually swim at around 3 to 5 miles an hour. If you have a boat coming at you at like 25, 30, 40, or even 50 miles an hour, there's no way you can get out of the way quickly enough. Oftentimes manatees will actually dive down, and that brings them right into the boating channel because they're trying to get out of the shallow water going into the deeper water, and that's exactly where the boats are, is in the channel. Also, our waterways, they're not really two-way streets. If you're picturing a deer trying to cross a road, it's going to have to deal with traffic coming from two sides. Now, if you're a manatee underwater, there may be boats coming from all around. So that makes it really difficult for manatees. So the problem is that manatees can hear those boats. They try to get out of the way, but either way, they don't know where the boats are coming from, or they're just not quick enough to get out of the way. So that would be the answer to that. Louis also wanted to know if there's a particular region of Florida known for increased numbers of rescues. It is pretty even all over Florida. We do see a lot of boat strikes in Southwest Florida. We do see a lot of red tide in Southwest Florida. If you're looking at cold stress, that can be anywhere around the state, especially in a colder winter. We do see a lot of boat strikes in Brevard County too. Now, Lee and Brevard County are usually the top counties for boat strikes. However, that also has to do with the amount of manatees in that area and the intercoastal, because you have more boats in those two areas. So you can't really compare, say, Brevard County with Seminole County, which is where I live, because all we have here is Lake Monroe. And I would hope that we don't have as many boaters and as many manatees in Lake Monroe as you guys have over in the Indian River Lagoon. So just looking at those statistics and those numbers is not necessarily saying, oh, the people in Brevard and Lee County are not doing such a good job protecting manatees. It's just because they have more manatees and they do have more boaters in those areas there as well. Chris had a question about the manatees nursing. How do they attach when they nurse? So basically the mammary glands, like I said, they're just located sort of in the, behind the flipper, like in the armpit area. So the baby manatee would basically just put its little snout around the mammary gland and then swim along with the mom. So it's not permanently attached. It was probably a bad example. That stuffed manatee that I had over here, it was sort of, hanging on the mom. Not necessarily the case with real living manatees. They, swim by the mom. But that's how they will nurse. Chris also wanted to know what waterway do manatees follow to get to Blue Spring. Yes, that would be the St. Johns River. We do have manatees that are coming from the north, so they may be coming from the Atlantic coast, going to Jacksonville, and then swimming south down the St. Johns River towards Blue Spring. Or we may have manatees that are coming from the south, so they may be spending their summer in, say, Lake Jesup, Lake Monroe, any of those lakes or tributaries down there, and then they will swim north to come to Blue Spring. So while they all have Blue Spring or the surrounding springs in the wintertime, they sort of disperse in the summer, and some will go to the Atlantic, some will actually go all the way up to Georgia. We have one manatee that's been tagged with satellite tracking device, and it's been going back and forth between Georgia and Blue Spring. So that would be the answer to that. Let me see. Terry wanted to know about improvements to boating restrictions. A lot of counties are working, they're usually working like at a county level to get not necessarily boating restrictions, but slow speed zones or idle speed zones into place, or sanctuaries. For example, in the wintertime, a lot of springs have areas that are closed off as sanctuaries where boaters and people cannot enter. I'm not sure about any data right now. I can definitely look into that. It always depends. Every couple of years, the manatee zones are evaluated county by county. And most counties, especially on the coast or by a waterway, have manatee protection plans in place. So oftentimes they are evaluated time after time, especially if you, for example, see an increase in watercraft mortality or a decrease in manatee usage. A lot of manatees, for example, from like northern Brevard were migrating to southern Volusia County. That could have a whole different reasons. For example, loss of seagrass could have driven them to go feed in other areas. So now we're suddenly seeing more manatees in South Volusia County, and there may not be as many protection zones for them in that area. So that's something they may be evaluating, you know, as it becomes available as well. But I can look into to some more data on that as well. Kathy wanted to know, are there any regulations in place to deter manatee harassment in areas with a lot of manatee tourism? I have observed many individuals harassing manatees in these areas. Yes, so that's actually something, glad you mentioned that right now. It's something we just started working on this week to produce some more public service announcements and educational videos that we're trying to distribute a lot wider than just on our website and our social media, because we really want to preach beyond the choir and reach people out, especially in areas where there is a lot of tourism, or where swimming with manatees is a big thing, like in Homosassa and Crystal River. So we're trying to make that available to the wider public, as well as to outlets that are offering guided tours, or that are renting equipment or renting kayaks, those kind of things, because oftentimes people really don't realize what are the do's and the don'ts. And they don't necessarily really mean anything bad, but they just don't know any better. So that's definitely something we're doing. We have volunteers helping with manatee observer programs, both at Blue Spring as well as at Fort DeSoto Park in Pinellas County. So we do have those in the summertime to try to educate visitors and prevent harassment. But there is a long way to go, because we have a lot of people moving to Florida, and we have a lot of people visiting and coming and don't even know what a manatee is. So there's always room for improvement.
And are they they're still protected under the Endangered Species Act, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So, and they still protect on the Endangered Species Act. They're just listed as a threatened species right now, and not as a endangered species, but it's the same protections that still apply to all of them.
And so it's usually a pretty hefty fine too if you're harassing them. So there's a monetary issue if you're harassing them, and then I don't know, depending on the level, you might be looking at maybe perhaps a misdemeanor for harassment.
Yeah, there absolutely is. The problem with that is that usually they have to be caught in the act almost for FWC to be able to do anything. So if I call FWC and say, here's a guy out here feeding or watering a manatee, most likely if the officer's actually not there seeing it, they may not be able to do anything about it. So still, anytime you see it, or you see somebody speeding through a manatee zone, try to get a picture, try to get the location and the date of where it's happening. If possible at all, try to get a picture of the vessel or the person doing the behavior and forward that to FWC. Some people, you know, are quote unquote stupid enough to actually post about their behavior on social media. So we did have people riding a manatee or cannonballing on a mother and a calf from their dock and then posting about it. And obviously that they just handed it to the FWC on a silver plate. But there can be hefty fines, and there can definitely be community service or even jail time, depending on how severe the misdemeanor is. So yeah. Absolutely. All right, let me see if there's I'm trying to take the questions as they're coming in. How did you get interested in manatees? So I'm trying to make a long story short. I actually didn't even know what a manatee was until about 9.5 years ago. I was working in New York, film and television of all fields, because that's what my background was in. Always been really interested in conservation and marine science, but I didn't go to school for it. And I went down to Florida for a television show we were working on, and the hotel we were staying at was actually running a promotion at the time about manatees. They were actually selling these stuffed manatees here, the cow-calf pair. And I had never heard of a manatee before. So my coworkers were trying to tell me this is a Florida manatee, it's an endangered animal. And I was like, what is that, a walrus, a dolphin? Like, I had no idea what it was. Anyway, so we bought the manatee. I started doing some research and adopted a manatee through Save the Manatee Club. actually made a documentary in 2013 about manatees, and that's how I got involved with Save the Manatee Club. So I started volunteering with them, helped them with their live webcams and some public service announcements, more like a communication outreach kind of thing, and then it transitioned more into the research over time. But like I said, I've been doing a lot of volunteer work with different organizations along the way. So this is sort of a long story short how I got involved with manatees in the first place. And I've been with them for about 6.5 years now. So Aaron has a question about, is progress being made in the amount of healthy seagrass in North Brevard region? So this is a really good question, and I do want to refer that to Pat Rose, who is my higher up, because he has a lot more knowledge about the seagrass situation and the power plant situation in Brevard County in the Indian River Lagoon. I do know that the seagrass has at least come back to some extent. I know we had a really bad die-off a couple of years ago, which again, it had a lot of different sources. So the seagrass was already sort of diminished, and it was affected by a nutrient overload. And then we had a cold winter in 2010, and that sort of made it cascade. It was almost like a ripple effect. So something that's already in a sort of bad state then got even worse. And then we do hear a lot that manatees are overgrazing. Manatees are actually destroying the seagrasses. Manatees and seagrasses have actually evolved together. So if there was a natural healthy balance between the manatees and the seagrasses, it wouldn't be that the manatees would be destroying the seagrasses. Manatees usually, like I said, act as a lawnmower, so they're actually just eating sort of the top of the grasses and they're not pulling out the entire roots and everything with it. However, obviously there's not much seagrass left, then having a lot of manatees eating that little seagrass that's left, that can potentially then become a problem. So Mark, I know, has he's sort of
real quick.
Name. Yeah.
The MRC has our lagoon report card, and we did just, we have the water quality data, and I believe we are also getting the seagrass data. And so hopefully in the next couple of months, we will have updated data from 2016 to 2019 that has information about the status of seagrass throughout the Indian River Lagoon. And so look for our website, look on our website for that to show up in the next few months. We just need to look at the data and get it coordinated.
Okay, great, awesome, because I didn't know that, so great. And I think Mark had a question, how do you answer people who contend manatees strip the lagoon of seagrass of their waste is a big contributor to the excess nutrients? Yes, we do hear that a lot, that manatee waste or manatee poop is destroying the seagrasses. Now, like I said, manatees and seagrass have evolved together, and the poop that manatees, the waste that manatees are emitting would actually not even affect the seagrasses or the lagoon in such a way that other nutrients that are being washed into the lagoon are affecting both the Indian River Lagoon and then in turn the seagrasses as well. So that can both be fertilizers, that can be a change in salinity, which is also affecting the growth of seagrasses. So I know there's a lot of muck removal going on right now as well, and believe me, the muck is not necessarily caused by manatee poop. If you're looking what's in that muck, that's not caused by manatees. So we do know that this is a question that comes up a lot. So again, I would like to forward that to Pat Rose, my higher up too, because he will be able to give a more elaborate scientific answer on how to specifically address that question as well. Michelle is saying, when you try get manatees, do you ask what? I'm not exactly sure what the question is. Maybe Michelle, or do you guys ask both?
Yeah, Michelle, if you could submit your question again. I noticed that you sent it in one more time, but maybe we can get back to that one later on. We are getting quite over on our time, so we won't be taking any more questions.
Yeah, answer the ones that are in there right now, and then we'll.
Yes, absolutely. I was just gonna say, I don't know if we'll be able to take any more through the question, but we'll answer the ones that we already have.
Okay, cool. I think there's only like 3 more questions. So Chris wanted to know, how is swimming with manatees allowed in Crystal River? So yes, Crystal River is a bit of a unique situation because the town was grandfathered into the swim with the manatees. There's a whole tourism industry built in Crystal River around swimming with manatees. It is only legal in Crystal River, and there are actually tours going out to take people out to swim with the manatees. And why this can be a really great experience, one of the things we really need to keep in mind is that we're entering the manatees' habitat. This is their home, especially in the wintertime. They really need those warm water springs. So you want to make sure you practice what I talked about, the passive observation, don't go after the manatees, don't chase them. So if you are swimming, try to pick an operator, a tour company that practices that passive observation. And that's sort of the short answer of why this is allowed in Crystal River, but it's really not allowed anywhere else in the state. How long does it take the manatee reintroduction process? So this, I believe, goes back to rehabilitation. So that really depends if a manatee is rescued, let's say, for a boat strike or for an entanglement, and it's an adult and it knows what to do. Oftentimes it goes into rehab for a couple of weeks or months, depending on the injury, and then gets released back out into the wild, and it will be fine on its own. Now, a completely different story if we rescue an orphan calf. Let's say we rescue a calf that's like 3 feet long and it's just been born. It's probably going to spend quite some time in rehabilitation. It can be anywhere between 2 and 5 years, and then it will take a lot longer for that manatee to be able to adapt to life in the wild. So they're usually outfitted with a satellite tracking device, so our partners can monitor to make sure that it adapts. And some of them adapt really well, and it only takes them maybe a couple of months or a year to adapt, and some have a bit more difficulty, potentially need to be re-rescued, brought back into rehabilitation, and then released again. So there are some that take quite a bit of time. It just really depends on the manatee, but especially with orphan calves, it can take a really long time to rehab them. So if they get adopted by a manatee, that's a lot better than us having to go out there and scoop it out and bring it into rehab. Question about my documentary is called Before It's Too Late, Manatee documentary. So if you go to YouTube and you look at Before It's Too Late, you will find the documentary. Let's see, I think I have one more question. What were some labs or research that you did relating to manatees? So I personally do the research. I didn't take any classes on manatees or any labs in school, but what I'm involved with right now is the manatee research at Blue Springs. So this is a life history program where we track manatees winter after winter after winter, and we keep track of how many manatees we have, how many have calves, how many survive from one year to the next. So it's a life history program, it's a genealogy. So that's the main research that I'm involved in, but there are a lot of agencies here in Florida, such as the University of Florida, Mold Marine Lab, many others that are doing research specifically studying manatees. So those agencies may be able to have a bit more information about what like college classes to take or what labs to take in order to get involved with marine mammal or manatee research, I believe. All right, so I think I'm sort of through it. I don't know, Nicole.
I think if Michelle's still with us, if you please submit your question to us through email, and we'd be more than happy to answer it. Thank you so much, Cora, for all this excellent information. Fantastic presentation. We got a lot of really great compliments from our participants. Thank you so much for staying after and answering all of our questions. That was fantastic as well. More positive comments are coming in, so thank you guys, and thank you to all the participants for your patience and participation in our virtual brown bag. Hopefully we'll keep on doing them, that's the plan. And again, thank you so much, Cora. If you guys have any more questions for her, I have put her email as well as Pat's email in the chat and through the QAs. There's also a couple more links. I will post the links on our website that we've talked about as well, just so that everyone has them. And we will also post the recorded presentation to our website, and Cora will also have access to that as well. And she'll have it through her website as well. So yeah, thank you so much again, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Cool. All right, Cora, I'm going to end the meeting, and it should record. All right, here we go. I also want to make sure that I save chat. Excellent. Okay. All right, and we are going to end the meeting. All right, here we go. All right, bye. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thank you. And meeting for